All right, let's start a new series. What do you think? You good for that? Good for starting a new series? So, question for you about this. How do you determine value? How do you evaluate success? The old saying, right, he who dies with the most toys wins, is ridiculous because he who dies with the most toys wins is dead. So do you evaluate success by how well you did achieving those goals you set back when you were in college? Do you evaluate success based on the footprint of your home, or the retirement account, or the ability you have to travel? Those would all be perhaps earthly ways to evaluate, but they all would fall short. We're going to take our time through a study of the life of David over the next several months. We're going to discover that true success is about having the compass of your life set on the North Star of pleasing the God who created you, and one day we'll evaluate all that we do. The title of the series is Resolute, because what you and I are going to discover is that the measure of success in life has very little to do with those other things, and everything to do with our heart. In particular, with our heart set on pleasing God in every season of life. Well, what you and I might term success could in fact be nothing more than a detour away from the best and highest success we'll ever have. Contrariwise, some of the greatest failures that we or our neighbors or our family or friends might evaluate about our lives could be the very time God will demonstrate His greatest power in our lives. What I'm saying is that what you and I need to be able to achieve in life the things that really are defined as success is a heart that is resolute. The word resolute means resolved, determined. It means someone who's tenacious, steadfast, persistent, single-minded, firm in purpose. This is what we need. In fact, the scriptures are very clear that God's evaluation of our success, that the heights we achieve or the depths we experience are measured by our heart. And can I remind you maybe, Deuteronomy chapter 6, the scriptures teach this, that great Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your... You should love the Lord your God with all of your heart. It's the first thing mentioned. Or how about Proverbs 4:23? Above everything else, guard your heart, for from it flow the issues of life. Or how about 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 9, where the Lord himself throws the gauntlet down and promises the eyes of the Lord rove to and fro throughout the whole earth, seeking to give strong support to those whose hearts are fully His. Or how about the invitation, Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 12 and 13 and 14. You will seek me, and you will find me. You will call upon me, and I will answer you. You will seek me, and you will find me. When you seek me with all of your, I will be found by you, says the Lord. The issue in our life of measuring success or failure has everything to do with heart. You and I so often measure our own lives or measure our success or our failure or the success or failure of others by those lesser issues. And so look at 1 Samuel chapter 16. It's the introduction to a young man named David. When we meet him in 1 Samuel 16, he's only a teenager. But David will rise to become the greatest king of Israel. David shares with Abraham and Moses the notoriety of being the greatest figure in the Old Testament. David is mentioned more in the New Testament than any other Old Testament figure. He composed nearly 100 of the 150 Psalms that we have. He established Israel as a military power. He set the worship for Old and New Testament. He built a team that would outlive him for decades, and he is called among all the people of all the scriptures. He is the only one twice called a man after God's heart. Don't know about you, but for me, when they plant me in the ground, if a son or daughter of mine were to stand and say, here's what I know about Dad, he was a man after God's own heart, I will be of all men most happy about that. David will stand as an example for us, whatever season of life in which we find ourselves, as an example of success, true success, because his heart was right. In 1 Samuel, we get to chapter 16, and we're sort of dropped in the middle of a narrative. We find ourselves in a transitional moment in Israel's history. For decades, Israel has been ruled by a king named Saul. Now, Saul started with strong beginnings, but he failed. Oh, he had some military victories. He had accumulated some wealth. He'd achieved some of the things on his to-do list, but in God's evaluation, he failed. He failed so spectacularly that in 1 Samuel chapter 13, God sent his great prophet Samuel to say to King Saul, Saul, you have failed. And the Lord himself has sought out, listen, these are hard words, someone better than you who will be your successor. The Lord has sought out for a man for himself, a man after his own heart. And he will raise him up to be prince over the people Israel. It's a strong rebuke to a failed leader. And we don't know how long, but years go by, and Saul has a series of additional failures, and one more time, Samuel is called to confront the king. It's the end of chapter 15, so maybe from chapter 16, let's just go back a couple of paragraphs. 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel is sent to confront a king who has been given a task and has utterly failed in the task. Not failed for lack of trying. He decided he knew better than what God had instructed him to do. He said, I'll do my own thing. And you get to verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15, and you get that strong rebuke. It's a question of value. Value. Listen, we talked about value. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? That would have rung in the ear of King Saul. He had been given a specific task. And in response, he didn't do the task. He put a veneer of religious ritual over that, and he kept all kinds of spoil from a military campaign and said, well, we're going to give some of that to God. Really what he was doing was enriching himself and his army. And so his excuse to Samuel when confronted with, why didn't you obey God, was, well, we're going to sacrifice. Does God delight in sacrifice more than obedience? Look at the end of verse 22. Behold, open your eyes and see this. To obey is, what's the word? Yeah. Let's talk about the value judgment. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. We cannot walk in disobedience and cover that with a veneer of spirituality or religious ritual and expect that somehow God values that. David is not a man after God's own heart because he was religious. David is a man after God's own heart because in every season of his life, he sought to please God. And so, in verse 23, rebellion is as the sin of divination. You're fighting against God. You're just trying to go your own way. Presumption is as the iniquity and idolatry. Now listen, verse 23, that last phrase. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. Let's just talk about the honest danger of someone who lives their life in rebellion against God. God says, Saul, I gave you a task. I communicated to you how to do that task, and you rejected. You said, I know something better. Okay? You know better. I'm going to leave you to your own choices. Sometimes God's judgment in our life looks like him saying, okay, I'll let you go. You have rejected my counsel. I will reject giving you any more counsel. In this case, King Saul will spend the rest of his reign in a spiraling downward plow through the soil till he crash lands in the earth. Samuel grieves from that. Look at the end of chapter 15, verse 34. There's this epic confrontation between two strong men. You've rejected God? Okay, God's rejected you, Saul, as king. That role to which he called you, for which he equipped you, you will not fulfill. Verse 34, Samuel went to Ramah, that's his home. And Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. They just, what do you do after? Well, you just go home. And Samuel did not see Saul again till the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. There's hurt. There's grief. A life that's set on valuing the wrong things, a life that's set on I'm going to do what I want and reject God's counsel for me is going to bring grief. Now listen, not only into our own lives, but into the lives of those who love us. Chapter 16 opens with the Lord speaking to Samuel. It's a redemptive moment. The Lord has a question. I love how often the Lord's communication to us often takes the form of question. How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him for being king over Israel? Apparently, in Samuel's grief, he was frozen. Now, what are you doing? I'm grieving. Yeah, well, what are you doing about what God said to go anoint the next prophet? I'm kind of grieving here. And the Lord says, well, how long are you going to grieve? Why don't you do something? And God gives him another task. Listen. In the midst of Saul's grief, God speaks to him and gives him another task. So often people feel like, well, you know, when my life is just right, when everything's all in order, I finally then I'm going to be used by God. No, likely the most effective times you're likely to be hearing God's voice or doing his will is in the time of hurt or grief or loss. And that's exactly what Samuel finds, and the Lord speaks to him. He reiterates his decision. I've rejected him from being king over Israel. I get the grief. I get this was a friend of yours. I get that you actually were the one who mentored him. But Saul's forfeit his potential, his privilege to lead. And verse 16 near the end, fill your horn with oil and go. If you've ever followed Sports Center, now you know the reference. Why do they say that? Why do they say that? Well, this is why they say that. And so fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have, and I have this underlined, I have provided for myself a king among his sons. Now, a couple of things we need to know. First of all, already years ago, God had told Samuel, Saul's not going to be king. Someone else is going to be king after him, and it's not going to be Saul's sons. He's already said that God has sought out for a man after his own heart, and he'll make him the prince and ultimately the king. Now he says, all right, Samuel, here's what you do. You go down to Bethlehem. It's a small town about 4 miles outside Jerusalem. Go to that town, and Jesse, his sons, one of his sons, is going to be the king. Now, a few things here. One, who's Jesse? Well, great question. I don't know. He was an influential guy down in Bethlehem that Samuel is going to go to see. Secondly, isn't it interesting? Which one of his sons will be king? Which one? We don't know. Samuel, in the midst of his grief, is called by God to go do something. And the Lord, as he so often does in our life, doesn't tell him anything except the next step. Wait, have you been there? Okay, go do this thing. Do it for me. Well, where do I go? Well, just do the next thing. Right now, all that Samuel knows, go to Bethlehem and find the Jesse family. Now, Samuel has a very realistic, very pragmatic response to that. Verse 2, Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And what he's referencing, what Samuel's referencing, is after the prediction that Saul would no longer be king, but someone else would be, Saul spirals downward in a paranoid fear. And he begins executing people. He begins to have spies out to watch. He's watching his back all the time. And Samuel says, "Listen, if I make this public show of going down to Bethlehem and I'm going to anoint, I'm going to pour oil and set apart one of Jesse's sons as the king, Saul's going to know that and he's not going to be happy. And I'll die." Now listen. If you think that setting your heart on being a man or a woman after God's own heart and determining to do His will is going to bring you prosperity and ease, you would be wrong. In Samuel's case, God gave him a little bit of information about where to go and who it was to see, and God brought with that a lot of fear and uncertainty. And you're going to find in your life, if you set your compass on true north, follow God's will, be a man, be a woman after God's own heart, you will find that you will experience grief and fear and uncertainty about the future. Because God calls us to walk into those dangerous situations. But what I love about it is how often we overthink what it is God calls us to do. And so look at the Lord's response to Samuel's, this could cost me my head. The Lord said, I see a lot of humor in the Scripture. I hope you do that simply because, the Scriptures deal with humans and we're really funny people. And this to me is like a duh. This is a Homer Simpson moment, right? Saul's going to kill me. What am I going to do? And what the Lord does is remind Samuel, listen. What have I already called you to be? Samuel was a priest. Okay, so the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord,' and invite Jesse to the sacrifice." It's like, Samuel, what do you do? Priest. Samuel is a priest. What do priests do? Sacrifices. Oh, I see. Do the job God called me to do, and in the doing of the job called me to do, God will fulfill His purpose for me. So being a man after God's own heart, a woman after God's own heart, may not mean I need to change what I do for a living. But it means I do it with an understanding that God Himself has called me to do this and will use my day-to-day obedience. He'll use my day-to-day obedience to accomplish something great in life. That's how we value success. So with that clarified, it's like, oh yeah, I guess I am a priest. Oh yeah, priests do sacrifice, don't they? This sort of makes sense, right? Like Saul should think nothing of this. And so, verse 3, this is so instructive if you're wondering what is God's will for my life. Invite Jesse to this sacrifice. Listen. And I will show you what to do. I will show you what you should do. Samuel, you're worried about 3 steps ahead. Will you just do what I've called you to do, and I will show you what to do when the time comes? How often our life is derailed, a life of obedience. How often it's derailed because we don't have all the answers. How about take the step God has called us to take with what we already know? And trust that God says, I will show you what you should do. And at the end of verse 3, and you shall anoint him for me, whom I declare to you. So still, the Lord doesn't tell him which one. You go, do what I tell you, and when you get there, you'll figure it out. And then once you're there and you figure it out, I'll tell you which one of these sons will be the king. Those of you that love sort of real specific answers are going to be maddened by how God leads Samuel and later David in his life. And verse 4, in contrast to Saul, and Samuel did what the Lord commanded. Can we agree that's a safe place to go? He did what the Lord commanded, and he came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? Why were the people of Israel, or of Bethlehem rather, the elders, the city council, why were they nervous about that? Well, think about Samuel. He just recently has given the news that Saul the king, and it was a very public confrontation, Saul the king's going to be removed. Now he makes a request to come talk to the elders of Bethlehem, and they got to be thinking, oh man, this could not be good. It's a recall election, right? But he assures them, no, I'm coming in peace this time. I'm not here to remove you from office. And so, are we in verse 5? Is that right? I may have lost my place. Are you tracking? Okay, it is at verse 5, is that right? Verse 5, okay, good. Just want to make sure. Sometimes I get lost up here. And so, you don't know that, but well, actually, you probably do know that. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. See, then he's repeating what the Lord's instructions were to him. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves. Come with me to the sacrifice. So prepare your life, prepare your family, and come on, elders, come to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So the elders, and then somehow Jesse and his family, they get an invite to this thing too. And it's like, wow, clean up, fellas, here we go. And they show up. Now, we don't really know, and I use a little sanctified imagination, how this happened. So was it in a public hall? Was it out on a beautiful landscaped picnic grounds? We don't know, but somehow there was this sort of semi-private gathering of the key religious leaders, the key political leaders, and Jesse's family, all in Bethlehem, and there's Samuel, the most famous prophet of this generation. And so word would have for sure gotten out. And verse 6, when they came, he looked on Eliab. So the Jesse family begins to trot in through whatever the entrance was to wherever they were eating. And when they came, that is Samuel, looked on Eliab. That's Jesse's oldest son, Eliab. God is my father. What an awesome name, right? He looked on Eliab and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Now, whether because he was the firstborn, he was the oldest, or whether there was something compelling about Eliab, Samuel said, that's the guy. Maybe, like most men, he's just like, that's the first one, my job's over, and I can go home now. I don't know, and the Lord speaks. The Lord said to Samuel, verse 7, do not look at his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. It doesn't mean he's rejected him eternally. It just means this is not going to be the king. What comes next is a defining moment in the Old Testament, because it reveals something very fundamental about how we live to please God. And it reveals an evaluation or a value question that God has. Here it is, verse 7. I have this part underlined. For the Lord sees not as man sees. And there's a play on word in the original. Over and over again in this particular chapter 16, the first 13 verses, the word look, see, vision, that idea is repeated. Here it's repeated 4 times. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man sees or looks on literally the face, the outward appearance, the face, the eyes. You and I, all we can see is what's happening on the outside, and we say, well, that's a handsome man there, or that's a beautiful woman there, or wow, look at the presence that he has with him, or look at her, she seems very well put together, or she's very intelligent. We see at that surface level. We are incapable of making accurate value judgments based on the data we get from without. We value extrinsic things, and the Lord, he doesn't see that way. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man sees on the outward appearance, but the Lord sees on the heart. You're looking at Eliab and thinking, this has got to be the guy. The Lord's looking and saying, however good Eliab is, he's not the right one. Question for us when it comes to value. Question for us. Do we see as the Lord does? Are we evaluating the heart? Let me just be real kind of applicational with us, real direct. Single person, you're determined you're going to find that one for you. For what are you looking? Now, we're going to see later that David himself was a handsome man, so it's not that the Lord is against beauty. Of course not. He created human beauty. But on your punch list of this is what I need in her or this is what I want in him, at the top of that list, will you put down heart? Husbands, we get to be middle-aged, right? And the years begin to take a toll. You evaluate what God's doing in your life. You evaluate your relationship with that precious spouse of yours. Will you also evaluate how her heart has grown? We live in a culture absolutely obsessed with the outward. Everything airbrushed, everything made to look beautiful and attractive. And in the constant push to stimulate a little more interest, you and I can skate right past the most important quality in any human being. Do they have a heart that's right and attuned to God's heart? Parents, will you, with the biggest hammer you can, drive into the heart and mind of your sons and daughters, cultivate your heart. All the other issues are secondary to that. Parents, will you not only commend them for being wonderful scholars and great athletes and wonderful actors and actresses and gifted musicians, will you on a regular basis reinforce that it is their heart that God watches? Women, and I know I'm on thin ground here because I'm not one, but I'm married to one of the most godly, beautiful I know. Will you be really careful about how much you listen to the world's evaluation of what beauty looks like? Or how sexually aggressive you have to be in this culture to find validation? And will you recognize that a gentle spirit, that a heart at peace before God is a great treasure for your husband, for that person that you want to marry, and before your God in heaven? Will you be at ease with who God made you to be as you evaluate? Guys, as we evaluate, wow, maybe the bank account isn't where it should be, or the house isn't as big as the co-owner of the company, or maybe the company didn't achieve this quarter what we wanted, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever our checklist is, will we stop and say, but my heart is right with God? Resolute in that, and we find true success in life. And here is Samuel, obedient, faithful, grieving the loss of a good friend in Saul, but still doing what God called him to do. And right away, the first good-looking guy who looks kingly, who walks by, he's like, that's the guy. And the Lord had to gently but clearly remind him, that's not what I'm interested in, Samuel. And look at what happens next. There's humor. It's like a beauty contest somehow. I don't know if they were all in the same order of birth, but Jesse, they're walking in through whatever entrance, and Jesse and the boys come in one after the other. So here we go. It's not Eliab, verse 8. Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. So think, like, if you're the boys, okay, your dad's calling you, hey, Eliab, come on, you. And Samuel, this intimidating, renowned figure, was like, no. It's like, really? All right, Abinadab, come on. Yeah, nah. I mean, it was the thumbs up, thumbs down. I mean, this is bad. And it gets worse. And now, by the way, this is the humor of this. Samuel, as far as we know, has not told anyone why he's there other than we're going to have a sacrifice. So these poor boys are being evaluated, and they don't even know for what. All they know is that all 7 of the first 7 fail. And so it goes to Shammah. That's an interesting name. That's Samuel's name. Samuel sees a kid named Sam. He's like, oh, that's a great name. No, thumbs down on that one too. And look at verse 9, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Verse 10, and Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Now, as far as Samuel, it's interesting the disjoint of who knows what. As far as Samuel knows, this is all of Jesse's sons. As far as Jesse knows, Samuel's there for an evaluation, but he doesn't know why. And so there's this impasse. And so, Samuel's like, well, Lord, you said one of his sons. And Jesse's like, well, the sons, they're here. And so Samuel asks a clarifying question. Verse 11, Samuel said to Jesse, hey, all the boys here? Are these all your sons? Now, if you have a big family, you understand this, right? Now, I don't. I have a small family. But if you have a big family, you get this. Honestly, how many of you have left a kid behind at the mall or at church? Yeah, exactly. But you got like 3 kids. How could you do it? You got one and you left him behind? That was on purpose, wasn't it? Yeah, all right. And, or how about this? I picture like family picture, and like you got, okay, everybody in here, everybody smile. And you take the picture, and it's not until you get the picture developed, and you're like, hey, we missed one. Wait a minute, where's the baby? And that's what's going on here. And so here's Jesse's response to that. There remains yet the youngest. Now, if you have an English Standard Version, you have a little number there, you have a little note. There remains yet, and the word literally is the smallest. Now, in Hebrew, it means the youngest, but it also means he was the runt of the litter. And was he much younger than the other boys? Well, if there's 7 older brothers, there's some years, maybe 20 years between Eliab, big impressive Eliab, and little old David. And so look at what Samuel says next. If you're hungry, you hate this. There yet remains the youngest, but behold, he's keeping the sheep. It's like we didn't even think to invite him because he's out with the woolies. And he probably doesn't smell good, and he's been out doing his job, and he's just the baby. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. I hate that. What do you do, right? The table is laid, it's ready, you can smell whatever they're having, and you're standing there like, a little longer here, You hate the drive-thru at McDonald's? You think that's bad? The drive-thru, actually, the worst is Portillo's. Am I lying? Is that right? Yeah, and that's got to be a 4-minute wait, and I'm just, you got the drool, and it could have been an hour. They got to go find him. They got to go bring him back, and can you imagine how happy the older brother, who's just been told, no, not you, go get your younger brother and bring him back, how happy he is. And so, verse 12, and then Jesse sent and brought him in. Now, here's how we know the Lord doesn't mind good looks, right? And so, now he was ruddy. Ruddy, the word means reddish, and so probably this means he was sunburned from his work out in the fields watching the sheep. And he was ruddy and it's an interesting play on words, considering it's just said the Lord does not look in the eyes. He had beautiful eyes. So there was something about David that was perhaps piercing in his gaze, that when you notice David, you notice, wow, look at that. I mean, his eyes are like they're looking right through you. Maybe that's it. We don't know. But something so compelling about David's eyes that it required a comment here in the scriptures. And he was handsome. And while those are wonderful things, they weren't the thing that God saw in him. This was a young man who was a man after God's own heart. Teenager, think about that. God had already identified in David's soul the things that would make him a man after God's own heart, and he was only a teenager at this time. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And Samuel took the horn of oil, he anointed him in the midst of his brothers. Again, if you have brothers, I have 2. How do you suppose that went? And we'll know in a couple of weeks when we look at David and Goliath how much his brother Eliab hated him about this. But there in the midst of the elders of Bethlehem and in the midst of his brothers, he was anointed. Now, we don't really think all the elders knew precisely what was going on, but it's kind of like, that's something special. What's happening there? And look at the end of verse 13. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And I love Samuel's sort of practical thing. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah, which is where he's from. And think about David's career path. When we meet him here, he is obscure. We know nothing about him except he's sunburned with piercing eyes, and he's a man after God's own heart. Oh, and he watches the sheep, and he's the youngest. In a very short time, he will be elevated to national fame, like a meteor streaking across the sky. And soon that fame will bring him crushing loss. And he will be a refugee, displaced from his home, driven away from the land that he loved. In one of the most dramatic turns of biblical history, he will then be elevated to be the king, and he will spend 2 decades as one of the greatest, mightiest kings until at the apex of his power, he blows it all in a fit of sensual sin. And the crushing backwash of that sin will cost him a decade of leadership and heartache. And there will come a time where, as an old man, he finds himself again a refugee, utterly dependent on friends to supply his most basic needs, like a meal to get through the day. By God's grace, he will be reestablished as king, even though it will be a crushing loss in his family. And he will end his days known as the sweet singer of Israel, a mighty man after God's own heart. In every one of those seasons of life, in the promise of youth, in the flower of maturity, in the declining fall of his life, David was a man after God's own heart. Walking in holiness and living in sensuality, his response even to rebuke over sin demonstrated he was a man after God's own heart. We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about a heart that's right before God. So even in sin, we respond in a way that honors him. What made him such a great man after God's own heart? He was resolute. The needle of that man's heart compass always pointed true north. So questions for us as we wrap up this first introductory message would be this: how can I be resolute? Let me give you 3 lessons I think we learn from this particular story, how to be resolute. First is this: listen for God's voice in every circumstance. As we value things in life, as we make decisions that have great impact and import for our future, listen for God's voice in every circumstance. Samuel, in anger at Saul's failure, listened to God's voice. Samuel, in heartbreak and grief over Saul's failure and God's rejection of Saul, listened to God's voice. Samuel, in fear about what it meant to follow God, listened to God's voice. Slow down enough. Weave enough quiet into your life. Turn off the incessant stimulation of electronic media long enough to hear the still small voice of God. Listen for his voice in your loss, in your success, in your uncertainty and your fear, in your sin. God speaks. A life that cultivates a heart after God's own heart listens for God's voice. That decision you're fearful about, that data that doesn't quite add up, stop and listen. When did we pray? And say, God, I don't know. Help me. Be in God's Word. I mean, if it's on your iPad, if it's on your printed book, if it's through a message or your podcast, listen! Gather the correct data. Samuel all throughout. Oh, no, not this one. Okay, well, not that one. Okay, well, not the next one. Okay, well, what do I do? Well, do you have any more? Okay, this one. And at every step, he's listening to God's voice. Second, how do I be resolute in this life? Obey God's will in every season. So that Samuel's greatness, and we will see later David's greatness, lie in the fact that in uncertain times, in good times, in loss, even in disobedience and sin, When hearing God's voice, then Samuel and David both responded by obeying. David, as we will find out, as you probably know, there's a few things known about David's life. David had a disastrous midlife crisis. And when God sent a prophet to confront him and David heard, David responded in obedience. That separates him from Saul, who when God sent a prophet to confront Saul, Saul made all kinds of excuses. So you and I can hear God's voice in every season, in every circumstance, and we can obey in every season. But I don't know. I don't know what 3 steps from now are. Right, well, will you do what the next thing is? And God promises, I will show you what to do when you get there. Okay, third, how to be resolute. Listen to God's voice in every circumstance. Obey God's will in every season. Third, expect God's power in every hardship. Let me fill that one in just for a minute. We're going to close here, but the pattern that develops throughout David's life is this. In times of uncertainty or deep hurt, David sensed God's presence very near. And when things were going along pretty good, David tended to drift. Now, maybe I'm the only guy in this room who can say, yep, I've lived that myself. But I would say this. A person who is a man or a woman after God's own heart is going to expect in hardship, I may sense God's power and presence more than ever before. Will you join me in Psalm 16? It's to the right of where we were there in 1 Samuel. And I'm going to invite our worship team to make the way back up front here. Psalm 16 is one of my favorite. It's almost near to being a life verse of mine because it's written by David from the perspective of older age, and he's looking back on what he valued. Look at verse 5. Are you in Psalm 16? Did you find it? Okay, good, thanks. Verse 5. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. Meaning what I got in life is the Lord, and the Lord is the one who controls my destiny. I have this underlined. This is very much a theme verse for my life. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. The boundaries that God has etched out for my life have been pleasant. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. Listen, sleepless nights can be gifts from God. Listen, here, verse 8. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. This is a man after God's heart. This is a woman who gets that God is near to those in hardship. Verse 9, therefore my heart is glad, my whole being rejoices, my flesh also dwells secure. Look at the promise of verse 10. You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, it's death. You're not going to abandon my soul to death or let your Holy One see corruption. Let's talk about the value. Let's talk about the value proposition. A heart that seeks after God can live this way. Look at verse 11. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is, say it with me, there is fullness of joy. And at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. This series, will you join me in being resolute about setting your heart on seeking after God? On doing that, you will find joy and pleasures that are eternal pleasures, far outstripping the passing pleasures of today. All right, I want to pray for us, and then we're going to close our service by singing. It's an anthem of our faith, our cornerstone in Jesus Christ. So stand, let me pray over us, and then we're going to sing. Let's stand together. Dear God, Make us men and women for you. May our hearts be like yours. God, we submit ourselves. You can do what you want with us. Shallow success, we reject. Temporary failure, we push through. We are resolute. This church, this congregation, individually as believers, in making the determined purpose of our life to please you. God, use us in ways we can't even imagine, I pray. We ask this in Jesus' strong name. And all God's people agreed by saying,